Ayrton Senna was already a legend long before the events of May 1st, 1994. Triple world champion, master of qualifying, and one of the most dominant drivers of his era, he arrived at the San Marino Grand Prix in Imola carrying both expectation and pressure. The weekend was already tense. Just a day earlier, Roland Ratzenberger had been killed during qualifying. Senna himself had witnessed the aftermath. On lap 7 of the race, leading in his Williams, Senna approached the high-speed Tamburello corner at nearly 190 miles per hour. It was a flat-out left-hander bordered by a concrete wall with almost no runoff. Suddenly, the car failed to turn. Instead of following the curve, it continued straight. Telemetry later showed Senna attempting to brake and steer in the final seconds, reducing speed to around 135 miles per hour before impact. The Williams slammed into the wall at a shallow angle. On impact, the right front suspension arm snapped and was propelled backward. A metal rod pierced through Senna's helmet visor, causing catastrophic head injuries. Marshals reached the car within seconds. He was unconscious but still had a pulse. Track doctors performed an emergency tracheotomy beside the cockpit before he was airlifted to a hospital in Bologna. Despite hours of surgery, the brain damage was irreversible. At 6:40 p.m., Ayrton Senna was pronounced dead at the age of 34. The crash at Tamburello marked one of the darkest days in Formula One history. We mentioned it just before. Roland Ratzenberger died only one day before Ayrton Senna, during the same tragic weekend at Imola in 1994. On April 30th, 1994, qualifying for the San Marino Grand Prix was underway. Ratzenberger, a 33-year-old Austrian driver competing in just his third Formula One race, was driving for the small Simtech team. Unlike many of his rivals, he hadn't risen through the sport with major backing. He had worked his way up through determination and smaller categories, finally reaching Formula One after years of effort. During his qualifying lap, Ratzenberger ran wide over a curb at the Acqua Minerale chicane. The impact damaged his front wing, but instead of returning to the pits, he continued at full speed. As he approached the fast Villeneuve corner at nearly 190 miles per hour, the weakened wing suddenly failed. Without front downforce, the car became instantly uncontrollable. The Simtech veered straight off the track and slammed almost head-on into the concrete wall at extreme speed. The deceleration was violent. Although the survival cell remained largely intact, Ratzenberger suffered a fatal basilar skull fracture, a severe injury at the base of the skull caused by the abrupt stop. Medical teams reached him within seconds, and he was airlifted to hospital, but he was pronounced dead shortly after. It was the first Formula One race weekend fatality in over a decade, and tragically, it would not be the last that weekend. Jules Bianchi was the most recent Formula One driver to lose his life as a result of a racing accident, marking the end of what many believed was the sport's fully modern safety era. On October 5th, 2014, the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka was being run in extremely heavy rain as a typhoon approached the circuit. Visibility was poor, and several drivers had already struggled with aquaplaning. Earlier in the race, Adrian Seudel had spun off at the Dunlop corner and hit the barriers. A recovery crane was deployed in the runoff area to remove his car, while the race continued under double yellow flags. On lap 43, Bianchi approached the same corner at significant speed. His Marussia lost grip on the soaked track and slid off along a similar trajectory to Seudel's car. But instead of stopping in the runoff, Bianchi's car continued toward the recovery vehicle. It struck the rear of the 13-ton crane at approximately 134 miles per hour. The impact was devastating. The top of his car collided with the underside of the crane, causing massive deceleration forces and severe head trauma. Bianchi was unconscious when marshals reached him. He was transported by ambulance to Mee University Hospital, where surgeons performed emergency brain surgery. Doctors confirmed he had suffered a diffuse axonal injury, a catastrophic form of brain damage caused by sudden rotational forces. He never regained consciousness. For 9 months, he remained in a coma while his family stayed by his side. On July 17, 2015, Jules Bianchi died from complications related to his injuries. He was 25 years old, and his death led directly to major safety changes in Formula One, including the introduction of the Halo cockpit protection system. Jochen Rindt remains the only driver in Formula One history to be crowned world champion posthumously, a title secured only after his fatal crash. On September 5, 1970, qualifying for the Italian Grand Prix was taking place at Monza. Rindt, driving for Lotus, was leading the championship standings and on course for his first world title. The Lotus 72 was one of the fastest cars on the grid, but it was also fragile. Team principal Colin Chapman prioritized speed and innovation, sometimes at the expense of structural robustness. During a high-speed run toward the Parabolica corner, Rindt's car suffered a sudden mechanical failure. Later investigations pointed to a failure in the brake shaft which caused an abrupt and total loss of braking power. Approaching the corner at around 170 miles per hour, Rindt had no way to slow the car. The Lotus veered offline and struck the metal guardrail almost head-on. Unlike modern circuits, Monza at the time had minimal runoff areas. The barrier acted less as an energy absorber and more as a rigid obstacle. Rindt was wearing only a lap belt, having removed the shoulder straps because he believed they restricted his movement in the cockpit. When the car decelerated violently, his body was thrown forward under the lap belt. The force caused fatal injuries to his throat and chest. He was still alive when extracted from the wreckage, but died shortly afterward from his injuries. Rindt's points laid proved insurmountable for his rivals, and 2 months later, he was officially declared the 1970 Formula One World Champion, a title he would never live to receive. Tom Pryce's death in 1977 remains one of the most shocking and violent incidents in Formula One history, not only because of how he died, but because of how sudden and unavoidable it was. On March 5, 1977, the South African Grand Prix was being held at Kyalami. Pryce, a 27-year-old Welsh driver for the Shadow Team, was considered one of Britain's rising talents. Midway through the race, another car driven by Renzo Zorzi pulled off with a small engine fire. Two marshals from the opposite side of the circuit reacted quickly and ran across the track carrying fire extinguishers. As Pryce crested a rise at nearly 170 miles per hour, one of the marshals, 19-year-old Frederik Jansen van Vuren, ran directly into his path. At that speed, Pryce had no time to brake or swerve. The impact was catastrophic. The marshal was killed instantly, his body thrown high into the air. But the tragedy did not end there. The fire extinguisher the marshal was carrying was struck by Pryce's car and launched forward at extreme velocity. It smashed directly into Pryce's helmet. The force of the impact caused massive head injuries, killing him instantly. His car continued down the straight for several hundred meters before coming to a stop. The race continued despite the double fatality. Pryce was pronounced dead at the scene. The incident led to stricter procedures regarding marshal positioning and track access during active racing conditions. Ronnie Peterson's death in 1978 was not the result of a single violent impact, but of complications that developed hours after what initially appeared to be a survivable crash. On September 10, 1978, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza began in chaos. At the start, the tightly packed grid funneled toward the first chicane, and contact between several cars triggered a massive pileup. Peterson's Lotus was caught in the collision and slammed into the barriers at high speed. The front of the car was crushed, trapping his legs in the wreckage. Moments later, the car caught fire. Several drivers stopped and rushed back through the smoke to pull Peterson from the cockpit. When he was laid on the track, he was conscious and speaking. Although his injuries were severe, they did not appear immediately life-threatening. Doctors later confirmed he had suffered more than 20 fractures in his legs and feet. He was transported to hospital in Milan, where surgeons operated to stabilize the broken bones. The procedure itself was considered successful. However, during the night, Peterson's condition deteriorated rapidly. Fat embolism syndrome developed. Fat particles from the multiple fractures entered his bloodstream and blocked vital blood vessels, leading to organ failure. By the morning of September 11th, his condition had become critical. Despite intensive care, Ronnie Peterson died at the age of 34. His death highlighted the hidden dangers of internal trauma and led to improved medical monitoring procedures for injured drivers following major crashes. Gilles Villeneuve's death in 1982 shocked the Formula One world, not only because of the violence of the crash, but because of the circumstances surrounding it. On May 8, 1982, qualifying for the Belgian Grand Prix was taking place at Zolder. Villeneuve, driving for Ferrari, was pushing hard in the closing minutes of the session. Just weeks earlier, tensions had erupted within the Ferrari team after teammate Didier Pironi had overtaken him against team orders in San Marino. Villeneuve arrived in Belgium, determined to prove himself on track. During his final flying lap, Villeneuve approached the Terlemenbocht corner at high speed. Ahead of him was Jochen Mass, who was on a slower lap. As Villeneuve closed in at over 140 miles per hour, Mass moved slightly off the racing line to let him pass. But in that split second, the two drivers made different assumptions about each other's trajectory. Villeneuve's Ferrari struck the rear wheel of Mass's car. The contact launched the Ferrari into the air. The car flipped violently, disintegrating as it tumbled across the track. Villeneuve was thrown from the cockpit during the series of impacts and landed heavily near the barriers. Medical crews reached him within moments. He was still alive but had suffered catastrophic cervical spine injuries. He was transported to hospital in Leuven, where doctors confirmed that the damage to his neck was irreversible. Gilles Villeneuve was declared dead later that evening at the age of 32. Wolfgang von Trips' death in 1961 remains one of the darkest days, not only for Formula One, but for motorsport as a whole. On September 10, 1961, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza was underway. Von Trips, a 33-year-old German driver for Ferrari, was leading the World Championship standings and on the verge of securing the title. Early in the race, as the field accelerated toward the Parabolica section at over 150 miles per hour, Von Trips was battling closely with Jim Clark's Lotus. Their wheels made slight contact, minimal at first glance, but catastrophic at that speed. Von Trips' Ferrari became unstable, lifted off the ground, and was launched into the air. The car flew toward the spectator area where fans were standing behind low fencing with little protection. The Ferrari crashed into the crowd before flipping back onto the track. The impact killed 15 spectators instantly and injured dozens more. Von Trips himself was thrown from the car during the collision. He suffered a broken neck and died at the scene. Despite the scale of the disaster, the race continued. The tragedy at Monza exposed the vulnerability of spectators and led to major changes in circuit design, including improved barriers and greater separation between fans and the track. It remains the deadliest accident in Formula One history in terms of total lives lost. François Cevert's death in 1973 marked the end of an era for Formula One and abruptly halted the rise of one of its brightest talents. On October 6, 1973, qualifying for the United States Grand Prix was taking place at Watkins Glen. Cevert, 29 years old, was driving for Tyrrell and widely seen as the successor to his teammate and mentor, Jackie Stewart. Stewart was preparing to retire after that race, and Cevert was expected to lead the team into the future. During a fast lap through the high-speed S's section, Cevert lost control of his car at around 150 miles per hour. The Tyrrell snapped sideways and struck the guardrail on the right side of the track. The impact sent the car ricocheting across the circuit into the barrier on the opposite side. The second collision was even more violent. The car was torn apart as it struck the steel barriers, which at the time were rigid and unforgiving. The structure of the car disintegrated, and the cockpit area was catastrophically compromised. Cevert suffered fatal injuries instantly. When marshals arrived, there was nothing they could do. Jackie Stewart, who came upon the wreckage shortly afterward, immediately understood the severity of the crash. The Tyrrell team withdrew from the race, and Stewart chose not to start what would have been his 100th and final Grand Prix. François Cevert died at the scene, ending a career that many believed would define the next generation of Formula One. Helmut Koinigg's death in 1974 remains one of the most disturbing accidents in Formula One history, not because of a violent explosion or a massive pileup, but because of a simple safety failure. On October 6, 1974, during the United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, the 25-year-old Austrian rookie was competing in only his second Formula One race. Driving for the small Surtees team, Koinigg was still adapting to the speed and demands of the sport's highest level. On lap 10, as he approached the fast right-hander at the end of the back straight, his right front tire suddenly deflated. At roughly 140 miles per hour, the car veered off the racing line and slid toward the guardrail. Under normal circumstances, the barrier was designed to absorb the impact and prevent further harm. But this section of guardrail had been improperly installed after an earlier accident that weekend. The lower rail was not correctly secured to the posts. When Koinigg's car hit the barrier, the bottom section collapsed while the upper rail remained rigid. The car slid underneath the top portion of the guardrail. The metal edge struck the cockpit at helmet height. The result was instantaneous and fatal. The barrier acted like a blade, severing Koinigg's head upon impact. Marshals arrived within seconds, but there was nothing they could do. His body remained strapped in the cockpit, the safety harness still intact. The race continued, and the public announcement gave few details. Koinigg's death exposed a catastrophic failure in circuit safety standards and reinforced the urgent need for properly engineered barriers, a lesson written in one of the sport's most brutal moments. And that brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like and help boost the video, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you soon. Bye.